Montana Territory. Autumn of 1878, the wind was sharp that morning in the Bitterroot Valley, hauling down from the mountains like it had something to prove. Francine Morrow stepped off the stagecoach with her gloved hands tight around the handle of her carpetbag, her heart pounding and her pulse louder than the creak of the wheels behind her. The long wool coat she wore hung loose on her frame, not because it was too big, but because she had grown too small during the journey west. The right side of her face remained tucked behind her hat's wide brim, as it always did when strangers were near. She had come all the way from Ohio, answering a mail-order bride ad in the Kansas City Gazette. A rancher in the Bitterroot Valley had written in, asking for a God-fearing, quiet woman who could cook and keep house. Francine had written back honestly. She could do all that. She was not afraid of work. She had no family left. She had a scar. She had not said how bad it was. Not at first. 2 months later, she arrived in the valley to find her would-be husband, a stout man named Charles Grady, staring at her like she was a ghost. "You did not say it was that bad," he said, voice low. Francine did not flinch. She had heard that tone before. "I said I had a scar. You never asked for more." Charles shifted his weight, eyes flicking to the jagged skin that dragged from her cheekbone past the corner of her mouth. "You should have told me. I have to think about my reputation." He turned and walked away. Francine did not cry. She stood there on the wooden platform in front of the post office until the stagecoach rolled off and the dust settled. Then, with nothing but her bag and a letter with a name that no longer mattered, she sat down on a bench and waited for the sky to grow darker. It was near sundown when someone walked past and then paused. Boots scuffed the dirt. A shadow shifted in front of her. "You waiting for someone?" a gentle voice asked. Francine looked up. A tall man with a wide chest and a trail-worn hat stood before her. His eyes were warm but cautious. He looked like he had weathered more winters than most, and his coat was patched at the elbow. His horse stood tethered nearby, dust on its flanks. "No," she said. "Not anymore." He glanced toward the depot, then back at her face. He must have seen the scar. Everyone always did. "I'm Foster Talbot," he said, voice steady. "I live about 12 miles west, run a small spread. I came in for supplies." Francine nodded once, unsure what else to say. "You got a place to stay?" he asked. "No," he shifted his weight. "There's a boarding house down the road, but it's full up with loggers, loud ones. If you want, I got an extra room in my house." "It is not much, but it is warm." Francine narrowed her eyes. "Why would you offer that to someone you just met?" Foster crouched in front of her, his voice lower now. "Because I saw what happened. That man left you behind like you were nothing. I do not believe in leaving people stranded. Especially not someone who came this far." She looked at him. Really looked. There was something in his face, not pity but patience. She had not seen that in a long time. "All right," she said. They rode back in silence. Her bag tucked behind his saddle, her hands curled around the back of the saddle horn. The land stretched wide, quiet under a rose-colored sky. When they reached his cabin near a creek bend, a small barn stood beside it. Smoke curled from the chimney. Inside, the cabin was clean and well used. A rocking chair sat near the fireplace. A rifle leaned by the door. A quilt lay folded on a narrow bed in the corner of the spare room. He helped her set her bag down. "You can stay as long as you like." That night, lying beneath a warm quilt with the wind tapping the window, Francine stared at the ceiling and tried not to feel anything. But her chest ached in a way that was not grief. It was something older than that. She was tired of being looked at like a mistake. The next morning, she woke to the smell of bacon and coffee. She stepped into the kitchen to find Foster at the stove, sleeves rolled up, 2 plates on the table. He looked up and gave her a nod. "I figured you might be hungry." She sat. Ate. Watched him move about the kitchen with the quiet ease of someone used to being alone. Later, he asked, "What did that to you?" She touched the edge of the scar. "House fire when I was 12. My little brother did not make it." Foster did not look away. "I am sorry," she nodded. "Most people are sorry, but they still stare." He met her eyes. "I am not staring, I am listening." Days passed. She stayed, helped with the dishes, mended a tear in his coat, fed the chickens. She did not talk much, and neither did he, but their silence felt different from the kind she had known before. This one was steady, safe. One morning she found him splitting wood behind the barn. He paused when he saw her, sweat on his brow. "I have been thinking," he said. "You should not have to go back east. You came here for a chance at something better. Maybe that chance is still here." She folded her arms. "You offering to marry me?" Foster wiped his forehead, looked right at her. "No, I am asking if you would stay, not as a guest, not as a burden, but as someone who belongs here." Francine stared at him. Her heart beat fast, but it was not fear this time, it was hope. "You do not care what people say about the way I look." He stepped closer. "I care about what I have seen. You came all this way alone. You took a man's rejection and held your head up anyway. That is not weakness, that is courage, and I see that more than I see anything else." Her throat tightened. She had spent years praying for someone to see her like this, not broken, not pitiful, but brave. She did not speak. Instead, she reached out her hand, resting lightly on his chest, and for the first time in years, she felt something steady beneath her fingertips. Solid. Real. Foster covered her hand with his own. Neither of them said anything more. They did not need to. Frost rimmed the fence posts by late October, and the cottonwoods had dropped most of their gold. Francine rose before light, tying her hair back with a ribbon she hadn't used since before the fire. It had been tucked in the lining of her bag all this time, forgotten until her fingers brushed it while searching for a thimble. She hadn't worn it in years, but somehow it felt right. She stepped into the kitchen and found Foster already dressed, tugging on his boots by the door. "Snow'll come early this year," he said, standing. "Need to bring the cattle down from the upper pasture. Might take a few days. Do you want me to ride out with you?" He scratched his jaw. "Wouldn't ask if I didn't think you could handle it." She didn't hesitate. "Then I'll pack the biscuits I made last night." They left at sunup, her on his spare mare. The trail wound through pine-shadowed slopes, the scent of damp earth and cold sap rising as they climbed. When a grouse burst from the underbrush, Francine's mount startled, but she kept her seat without flinching. Foster gave her a look, not of surprise, but of quiet approval. By afternoon, the slope opened into a broad, grassed hollow where a dozen head of cattle grazed under the watch of a dun-colored dog. Foster gave a low whistle, and the dog trotted over, tail low, ears alert. "Name's Birch," he said. "Found him caught in a trap 2 winters ago. Took to me after." Francine reached out slowly, letting the dog sniff her glove before scratching behind his ears. "He's got good judgment." Foster's gaze lingered on her, unreadable. They worked side by side for hours, easing the cattle down the ridge, guiding them through narrow draws and across streambeds slick with early ice. As dusk settled, they made camp beneath a stand of firs. Foster built a fire while she unwrapped the biscuits, now cool and crumbly but still filling. She handed him one. "You always do it alone." "Most years," he said, stretching his legs beside the fire. "Had a brother once. We ran the place together until he took off for Colorado, prospecting, never came back." She waited, sensing there was more. "He sent one letter," Foster added after a moment. "Said he found gold, said he was going to marry a saloon singer, then nothing. Might be he meant to write again, might be he didn't." Francine stared into the crackling wood. "My mother used to say people leave in 2 ways: by dying or by deciding not to come back. Both hurt the same." He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had softened. "You miss her. She died in the same fire. My father, too." Foster watched the flames a while. "You ever talk about them?" No one ever asked. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. Just long enough to feel settled. Later, when the fire had burned low and the cattle had bedded down, they lay wrapped in separate blankets beneath the open sky. The stars poured overhead in cold white rivers. Foster's voice came quiet across the space between them. "The house feels different with you in it, not just fuller. Better." Francine turned her head, the brim of her hat brushing wool. "I never thought I'd belong anywhere again. You do now." In the morning, frost cracked beneath their boots as they broke camp and drove the cattle the rest of the way home. The valley lay below them, edged with pale mist, the roof of Foster's cabin just visible beyond the trees. As they approached, a neighbor on a wagon trail hailed them. "Talbot, heard you had a woman staying out your way. Folks are wondering." Foster didn't look away from the road ahead. "She's not staying, she's building a life with me." Francine didn't speak, she didn't need to. The words had landed in her chest and taken root. That evening, she lit a lantern while he stacked the last of the split wood against the house. Birch curled on the porch, tail twitching once. Inside, she stirred a pot of stew while Foster cleaned his hands at the basin. When he came to the table, she glanced up. "I'd like to plant a garden come spring," she said. "Beans, maybe, and carrots. If I'm staying, I want to grow something that lasts." Foster reached for her hand across the table. "Then we'll plant it together." By November, the first snow had settled into the folds of the valley, pale and fine as sifted flour. It hushed the land in a way that made every sound more deliberate: the creak of the barn door, the crunch of boots on the path, the whistle Foster used to call Birch in from the field. Inside the cabin, the warmth held steady. Francine had taken to baking on Sunday afternoons, not out of duty, but because the scent of cinnamon and clove made the place feel more like it belonged to both of them. She'd found his mother's old crock of spices in the back of a cupboard, and though the labels were faded, her nose remembered what was what. Foster entered with a dusting of snow on his shoulders, holding a folded paper between his fingers. "Came in the mailbag from town. Addressed to you." Francine wiped her hands and took it. The envelope was thick, the handwriting unfamiliar. She opened it carefully at the table, her breath catching as she unfolded the page. "What is it?" Foster asked, setting his gloves by the hearth. She didn't answer at first. Her eyes moved slowly across the lines, her brow furrowing. "It's from Reverend Mallory, from back in Dayton. He says someone's been asking after me, a man from the insurance office, wanting to confirm if I survived the fire. Says there's a claim that was never settled, and if I'm still alive, I might be owed something." Foster leaned against the mantel, watching her closely. "You going to answer?" "I don't know." She folded the letter again. "It feels like something from another life. One I buried a long time ago. You don't have to decide tonight." She nodded, slipping the letter into a drawer. "I'll think on it." That night, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and carrying the distant cry of an elk across the valley. Francine lit a second lamp and sat by the window, sewing patches into a flannel shirt that had lost a cuff. Foster joined her, dragging the rocker close, a book of trail journals in his lap. After a long stretch of quiet, she spoke without looking up. "When you were a boy, what did you think your life would be?" He shut the book and rested it on his knee. "Didn't think much past the next season. My father used to say land doesn't care about your plans. It only answers to weather and work. I guess I figured I'd end up like him. Hard hands, quiet evenings, no one to tell my stories to. You've got someone now." He looked at her long, then said, "So do you." The lamps burned low. The fire cracked once, then settled into embers. She set down her sewing and crossed to his chair, kneeling beside it. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she said. "Not just from people, but from the voice in my head that tells me I'm too damaged to be wanted." He reached for her hand, calloused fingers fitting gently around hers. "That voice is wrong. I see you, all of you. And I thank God every day that man walked away so you could find your way here." She leaned her forehead against his shoulder, and for a while they stayed like that, no need for more words. The next morning, Francine woke to the sound of a saw. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the cold light of the yard. Foster was by the barn, cutting boards into measured lengths. "What are you building?" she asked, moving closer. He glanced up, his breath curling white in the air. "Something I should have started a while ago." He pointed to the patch of bare ground near the garden fence, now marked with stakes and twine. "That's where the new room will go," he said. "If you're staying, I want you to have a space that's yours. Not borrowed or spare, but built with you in mind." She took a breath, feeling something in her chest shift like a door had opened that she hadn't known was shut. Then I'll help you build it. They worked side by side for days, sawing, hammering, measuring by hand. He let her mark the beams, taught her how to use a square. At night they soaked their sore hands in warm water and shared bread by the fire. The room rose slowly but steadily, frame by frame. One evening, as the sky turned slate and the frost deepened, Foster reached into the inside pocket of his coat and drew out a simple gold band. He didn't kneel. He didn't make a speech. He held it out in his palm and said, "I want to build a life with you, not just a room, not just a season." All of it. Francine looked at the ring, then at him. Her answer was quiet but steady. Yes. He slid the band onto her finger, then kissed her once, gently, reverently. Later that night, she stood at the window, her hand resting on the glass. Snow had begun to fall again, soft and slow. Behind her, Foster wrapped his arms around her waist, his chin resting near the curve of her neck. They watched the snow fall together, the room behind them warm with promise. The cold deepened in December, but inside the cabin, warmth pulsed steady from the stove and the steady rhythm of shared tasks. The new room stood framed and roofed, its walls still open to the studs, but the space already felt claimed. Francine had chosen the south-facing side for the window, where the light would come in earliest. A narrow shelf beneath it waited for seed packets and a jar of buttons. One afternoon, while Foster was out clearing fence lines, Francine walked the edge of the creek at the back of their land, a kerchief tied over her hair and her arms wrapped in a worn shawl. The snow came up to her calves in places, but she liked the sound of her boots pressing into it, the hush of trees under weight. She hadn't walked this far before, and when she crested the slope behind the cottonwoods, she stopped. A small grave marker stood at the edge of the trees, weathered but upright, lichen clung to the wood. She stepped closer and read the name, Joanna Talbot. Beneath it, the dates stretched only 16 short years. When Foster returned at dusk, dusted with snow and smelling faintly of pine resin, she met him at the door. "I found her grave," she said. "Your sister," he nodded, pulling off his gloves slowly. "She was my mother's last, born too early, never quite strong. She died before winter broke that year." Francine waited, but he didn't look away. "I built the marker myself. Took me a whole day to cut the plank even. I come up there every year on her birthday, bring something small, a daisy once, a ribbon the next. Just so she's not forgotten." Francine stepped closer and reached for his wrist. "You remember people in quiet ways. That's the only way I know how." Later that week, while Foster rode into town to check on a shipment of nails and window glass, Francine stayed behind to work on the quilt she'd begun. The fabric came from a worn dress she'd brought from Ohio and scraps of Foster's old shirts he'd set aside without question. She stitched each square with small, deliberate movements, her needle rising and falling like breath. Birch lay curled near the hearth, tail twitching now and again in his sleep. Outside, sleet tapped against the shutters, and the smell of smoked ham from the crock warmed the room. When Foster returned, he carried a wrapped bundle in oilskin and a narrow box tied with twine. "You didn't have to bring anything," she said, rising. "I didn't have to," he agreed, "but I wanted to." He handed her the bundle first. Inside was a length of soft flannel in a dusty blue. "For lining the quilt," he said. "Figured it'd feel better against your skin than the rough weave." She blinked once, then touched the fabric to her cheek. "It's perfect." He set the narrow box on the table. "This one's from the general store. I saw it on the shelf and thought of you." Inside the box was a hairbrush carved from dark walnut, its back inlaid with a tiny brass flower. She ran her fingers over the smooth wood, then looked up. "No one's given me a gift since I was a girl." Foster pulled out a chair and sat beside her. "Gifts ought not to be earned. Sometimes they're just a way of saying, 'I'm glad you're here.'" She reached across the table and took his hand, resting hers over it. "I'm glad I'm here too." That night, they sat by the fire and read aloud from one of the books he'd brought from town, a journal written by a woman who'd crossed the plains in a covered wagon, her words plain and spare. Francine read until her voice softened, and Foster took the book from her hands and finished the next few pages. When sleep came, it came easily. The next morning, Francine rose early and stepped outside to gather kindling. She paused when she saw a small bundle wrapped in muslin at the edge of the porch. Tied with twine and resting atop a folded square of newsprint, it looked too carefully placed to be dropped. She crouched and opened it. Inside were 3 misshapen biscuits, a jar of pickled carrots, and a short note in a child's hand. "Thank you for helping Mr. Talbot not be so alone." She stared at the words for a long moment, then folded the page and tucked it into her apron. When Foster came out moments later, she handed him the note. "That's from the Gibbons girl," he said. "Her mother passed last winter. I helped them with their woodpile." Francine nodded. "Seems like they're grateful." He looked at her, his brow furrowed in that way he had when something mattered more than he could say outright. "You've changed things here," he said. "Not just for me." Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. "So have you." They stood there a moment longer, the wind tugging faintly at their collars. Then they went inside together. The wedding was quiet. It took place on a clear day in mid-December, the snow packed firm and glittering under a pale sun. Foster had asked the preacher from Lolo to come out, and Francine had sewn ribbons to the edge of her only good shawl. They stood together under the bare cottonwoods behind the cabin, the dog watching from the steps, and spoke their vows without trembling. Afterward, a few of the neighbors came by with pies and jars of apple preserves. Someone brought a fiddle, and though no one danced, the music warmed the air like a wood stove. Francine stood beside Foster as folks offered their well wishes, her hand resting lightly on his sleeve. No one looked at her with pity. They looked at them both like something had been made whole. That night, when the guests had gone and the leftover pie had been wrapped in cloth, Foster brought her into the new room. The window pane had been set in 2 days earlier, and a narrow bed stood against the wall, covered in the quilt she'd finished just that morning. She had stitched their initials into one corner, careful and small. He stood behind her, his hand at her waist. "I was thinking we could build shelves in here come spring," he said. "For your books, and a place for whatever you plant." She turned to face him. "I was thinking we could build a bench for the porch. I'd like to sit and watch the creek when the thaw comes." His eyes softened. "Then we'll do both." They lay side by side that night, the window frosted at the edges, the room still holding the faint scent of cut pine. Neither of them spoke for a while. There was no need. The quiet between them no longer felt like a space to be filled, it felt like a place they'd made together. Winter settled deep. The days grew short and silver, the nights long and layered with wind. Francine took to reading aloud after supper, her voice steady, while Foster carved wooden handles for kitchen tools. He showed her how to oil the grain so it wouldn't split, and once she asked him to teach her to sand the edges smooth. Birch followed them from room to room, curling near the stove when they sat. One morning, she woke to the sound of chopping. She stepped into her boots and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, finding Foster at the stump behind the barn, splitting the last of the stacked cedar. He paused when he saw her, then handed over the hatchet. "Your turn," he said. "Time you learned," she raised a brow. "You sure your pride can take it if I'm better than you?" He grinned. "I'll risk it." She took the handle and swung, the first strike bit deep. The second split the log clean through. He nodded once, and though he didn't say anything, she saw it in his eyes, that same quiet admiration that had never once been forced. By late January, the days began to stretch. One afternoon, Foster returned from riding the fence line with a canvas pouch slung over his saddle horn. Inside were 4 seed packets: beans, carrots, squash, and turnips. "I told Mrs. Curran in town we were planting come thaw," he said. "She gave me these. Said they were extra." Francine turned each packet in her hands. "I've never planted anything that lived." He set the pouch on the windowsill. Then we'll learn how together. The days continued, simple and full. She mended the hem of his shirts as he restrung the porch railing. He cleared brush while she lined the pantry shelves with muslin. At night, they read or sat with their shoulders touching, the hush of the land pressing close around them. One evening in early March, Foster brought in a cedar box he'd built by hand. He set it on the kitchen table without a word, and when she opened it, she found a row of paper envelopes, each labeled in pencil. "They're letters," he said, watching her. "For you, one for every month we've had together." "I started writing them the first night you stayed." Francine pressed a hand to her chest. "Why didn't you show me before?" "Because I was waiting until I knew you'd stay." "Not because you had nowhere else to go, but because you wanted to." She reached for him, her hand curling at the base of his neck. "I've never wanted anything more." That spring, when the ground softened enough to take a spade, they planted their garden. The dirt was cold and stubborn, but they worked it slowly together. Francine pressed the seeds into the earth with her gloved fingers, and Foster marked each row with a whittled stake. They built the porch bench after the thaw, and on warm evenings, they sat on it side by side, the creek whispering beyond the cottonwoods. She rested her head against his shoulder, and he laced his fingers with hers. One morning in June, Francine stood by the window, the breeze lifting the hem of her dress. She turned when she heard him step into the room. "I think we should add a cradle," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "I'm late." Foster didn't speak. He crossed the room and wrapped her in his arms, holding her close. She felt the steadiness of his breath against her cheek, the strength of his silence. When he finally pulled back, there was a softness in his eyes she hadn't seen before. "We'll build it strong," he said, "and we'll build it together." The garden bloomed by midsummer, thick with green. The porch held the warmth of the sun long after dusk, and the house, once quiet and spare, now pulsed with the rhythm of a life begun in hardship, shaped by patience and held fast by love. They had not found peace by stumbling into it. They had carved it out one day at a time. And they never let it go.